Michigan 1991 cold case solved. Arrest shocks community. The house on Alder Ridge still held the kind of silence that made breathing feel like trespassing. Even after 30 years, the living room remained staged in a tableau of halted time. A thin veil of dust softening the edges of the past, shadow pooling in corners untouched by daylight. It was a room preserved only because no one had dared disturb it, not the remaining family who couldn't bear to return, not the neighbors who spoke of it in careful murmurs, and certainly not the investigators who had once walked through it with the rigid confidence of professionals who believed truth bent toward persistence. It didn't. That was the first mistake. The crime had been labeled cleanly in the old case file. Homicide of Lena Marlowe, age 27. But nothing about it had ever felt clean. Lena, with her soft-voiced patience and quiet scholarship in urban ecology, had been found lying beside the coffee table, not in a position of struggle but of surrender, legs tucked slightly inward, one hand resting near a fallen library book as though she had simply drifted sideways and left her life mid-thought. There had been a single blunt force injury delivered with an object that had never been recovered. No forced entry, no confirmed visitor, no known conflict. A life interrupted with precision, leaving investigators with a strange absence of narrative. People expected chaos in crimes like this. Instead, they found order. Detective Samuel Rourke, then still in his early 30s, had led the original investigation. In the photographs, he looked composed, almost severe. In memory, he recalled the case differently, late nights spent packing the precinct, replaying details that refused to align, witnesses who remembered nothing useful, community members who closed their windows when he walked by. No one wanted to believe that such harm had slipped so easily into their quiet Michigan town, and perhaps that reluctance had seeped into the investigation itself. Now, 30 years later, Rourke pushed open the front door again. The hinges issued a faint, reluctant groan. He stepped inside, letting the musty air settle against him like a long-held breath finally released. His footsteps softened in the dust, and though he kept his expression steady, something flickered beneath it, a recognition that this room was not just a scene but a residue of his own shortcomings. He had never admitted that aloud. He didn't intend to now. A faint winter draft rattled the loose corner of a curtain, and Rourke paused. The moment felt almost like a flashback, as though the walls leaned forward trying to remember him. The air smelled of stale paper and aging wood. He scanned the space, the lamp still crooked, the couch cushion indented where Lena had last sat, the coffee table holding a ghostly outline where that single library book had lain before officers removed it and sealed it into evidence. Everything quiet, everything still waiting. He crouched, fingertips hovering above the carpet but not touching it. He had always approached this case with a kind of emotional distance, as if neutrality could coax order out of tragedy. Yet here, solitude pressed inward, urging him to acknowledge the weight of what had been left undone. He inhaled sharply, stood upright again, and reminded himself why he was here. The case was open once more. Something had shifted. Something new had surfaced. Outside, the sky hung low and gray. Inside, the past remained steady, cold, and observant. 2. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. It had begun 3 weeks earlier, when the county storage facility initiated a standard review of legacy evidence, the kind of administrative work that usually passed unnoticed unless something went wrong. A technician cataloging old boxes marked for digital conversion found an envelope mislabeled in faded ink. Inside was a contact sheet of photographs, previously thought missing, and a small plastic evidence sleeve containing a fragment of dark varnish. At first, the technician assumed both items belonged to a different case. There had been no mention of varnish in the official documentation for the Marlowe file, but the timestamps on the contact prints didn't lie. They placed the fragment at the scene. That should have been impossible. When the technician alerted the department, Rourke was the first to receive the call. The voice on the other end was cautious, hesitant, aware that resurrecting a cold case this old required both certainty and delicacy. Rourke listened without interrupting, though the words brushed against a part of him he had sealed off years ago. Evidence unaccounted for, and not just any evidence but physical material that might link to the murder weapon. If the fragment was legitimate, it meant something critical had been overlooked, or misplaced, or buried. The next morning, Rourke reported to the lab, his posture squared beneath the fluorescent lights. The forensic specialist placed the small evidence sleeve on the table between them. Inside, the varnish chip looked insignificant, a flake of dark material no bigger than a fingernail clipping. Yet the texture suggested layered application, and the sheen indicated exposure to repeated handling. A weapon with a varnished surface, possibly wood, possibly furniture, possibly something held by someone who believed it ordinary. Where did this come from? Rourke asked, though he already knew the answer wouldn't satisfy him. It was filed in the wrong series, the specialist replied. But the timestamp matches the initial sweep of the Marlowe residence. Someone collected it early on. Someone, but no record existed of who. Rourke felt the beginnings of a familiar tension, a cold tightness that settled along the base of his spine. This wasn't just an administrative oversight, it was a fracture in the foundation of the case. When he revisited the original evidence logs later that afternoon, he confirmed what he already suspected. There had been an unexplained gap during the first 48 hours, a period dismissed at the time as clerical congestion. But now, with the rediscovered fragment, that gap felt deliberate, or at least consequential. If the varnish had been linked to an object inside Lena's home, why had no one followed up? And if it belonged to something brought in by the killer, why had it been ignored? The department authorized the case to be formally reopened. Word spread quickly through the small Michigan community. The Marlowe case had lingered in the local conscience for decades, resurfacing occasionally in interviews, podcasts, and late-night discussions among those who remembered Lena as the soft-spoken woman who helped neighborhood kids with homework and volunteered at the Wildlife Conservancy. For many, the idea of reopening the investigation stirred unease, not because they feared the truth, but because long-held narratives were suddenly vulnerable. People preferred their ghosts predictable. Rourke didn't attend the community forums that followed. Instead, he sat in his office, the rediscovered evidence placed at the center of his desk like a quiet accusation. He studied the fragment under the desk lamp, its glossy surface reflecting a muted band of light. The varnish seemed too dark for household furniture, closer to something crafted, perhaps a hobbyist tool or a decorative object. He scribbled notes, cross-referencing household inventories, interviewing archival staff, revisiting the early witness statements. Every path branched into uncertainty. But uncertainty was no longer an excuse. The case had come back to life, and with it, his responsibility. 3 investigator examines, past reports to identify overlooked details. Rourke returned to the precinct archives with a methodical determination that differed from his approach 30 years ago. Age had stripped him of the illusion that intuition alone could carry an investigation. Now, he relied on discipline, slow reading, structured cross-checking, and a willingness to confront errors he might once have glossed over without noticing. The case file was spread across a large table under a cone of warm lamplight. Statements, photographs, scene sketches, lab reports, dispatch logs. The pages emitted the dry smell of aged pulp, and each time he turned one over, dust lifted in faint spirals, dissolving in the air. He felt the weight of it, not nostalgia, not regret exactly, but the steady hum of something unfinished. He began with the officer field notes from the first responders. Their handwritten observations were precise yet strangely detached, as though they had arrived at a scene expecting a conclusion, not a question. One officer mentioned the faint smell of pine oil near the coffee table. Another noted that the interior lock on the front door showed no signs of tampering. A third described Lena's posture as unusual but peaceful. Rourke paused on that line, eyes narrowing. Peaceful was not a word used lightly in such contexts. It suggested the absence of struggle, which had been the prevailing interpretation for decades. But peaceful didn't mean voluntary. He moved next to the witness interviews. Lena's neighbors described her as calm, private, and academically focused. She lived alone, kept regular routines, rarely entertained visitors aside from occasional study partners. No reports of conflict, no history of arguments or disturbances. Several neighbors recalled hearing her vacuum earlier in the day, but no one remembered hearing anything afterward. The silence of that afternoon still echoed in their testimonies. As he compared statements, he noticed a small inconsistency. One neighbor recalled seeing a vehicle parked near the Marlowe home around dusk, a dark sedan, possibly navy or black. But another neighbor, giving a statement 3 hours later, insisted no unfamiliar vehicles had been present at any point. The contradiction had been brushed aside at the time as an error of perception. After all, the light had been fading. People misremembered. But now, with the rediscovered varnish fragment, the discrepancy felt more important. Vehicles brought people, people brought objects, objects left residues. Rourke flipped to the old photos, grainy prints with muted contrast. The living room appeared orderly, almost curated. A stack of academic journals on the side table, a glass of water half full, curtains drawn just enough to allow ambient evening light. But in the far right of one photo, partially obscured by shadow, Rourke noticed something he had never paid attention to before, a small indentation on the wooden molding near the hallway entrance. He leaned closer, adjusting the lamp to catch the texture. The indentation looked like an impact mark, shallow but distinct, as though something hard had grazed the surface. He checked the scene sketches. No mention. Checked the original evidence list. Nothing. Checked his own notes from the time. Nothing. A soft breath escaped him, nearly a sigh. We didn't look closely enough. The molding had been painted over years ago, but the indentation in the photograph remained clear. If the varnish fragment matched the shape or layering of the object that struck that molding, then for the first time, they would have a trajectory. A moment of movement inside the room, suggesting a struggle or at least an unexpected motion. That alone contradicted the old conclusion. He set the photos aside and continued reading. Hours passed. Darkness pressed against the windows. The quiet of the archive room made each page turn sound deliberate. Rourke scanned the final coroner's summary again. No defensive wounds, no indication of prolonged contact. Cause of death, cranial trauma. Estimated time of death, between 5:40 and 6:20 p.m. He rewrote the numbers on a separate sheet, circled them twice. The neighbor who claimed to see the sedan had reported it around 5:30. That put the car, if it was real, within minutes of the interval. He returned to the varnish chip, held it under the lamp. The grain of the coating suggested older craftsmanship, possibly handmade. He thought of Lena's hobby. She volunteered at a wildlife conservancy but had no woodworking interests, no collection of carved objects, no known items in her home that might match the fragment. So why had something varnished been in her living room? More importantly, who had brought it? Rourke closed the folder and straightened his back, the weight of new possibilities settling across his shoulders. The past wasn't just resurfacing, it was rewriting itself, one quiet detail at a time. The room felt colder now, as if the case itself were watching him. The renewed investigation expanded slowly, almost surgically, as Rourke re-examined the landscape of people who had once circled Lena Marlowe's life without ever stepping fully into it. Suspects, the word felt heavy, though he used it sparingly, emerged not through dramatic revelations or whispered rumors, but through the quiet reappearance of old names in forgotten reports. The case did not yield suspects in a flourish. It produced them the way frost appears on glass, gradually, almost invisibly, until the surface was covered. The first person of interest was Harold Lennett, a neighbor whose property bordered the wooded path behind Lena's home. In his original statement, he had mentioned seeing her from time to time, his language careful and non-committal. He described her as polite but distant, No conflict, no history. But as Rourke revisited the logs, he found an old note indicating that Harold had been repairing outdoor furniture the week before the incident, and the varnish he used was documented as dark, layered, and handmade. The coincidence was delicate, not damning. Still, the details aligned just enough to register. When Rourke interviewed Harold again, the man's manner was subdued. He tightened his jacket as though the room had cooled despite the steady heating vent. "You think this is about me?" Harold asked. Not defensive, more confused, tired. He looked older than his age, the soft lines of routine shaping his face. "I think nothing yet," Rourke replied. "I'm resolving loose ends." Harold nodded slowly. His hands rested on the table, palms flat, fingers steady. "I worked on chairs that week, yes, but I never brought them near her place." "What about the wooded path?" Rourke asked. A pause, small but perceptible. Harold's eyes flickered downward. "I walked it often. It's the quickest way to the lake." "Did you pass near her house that evening?" Another pause, longer this time. Harold inhaled. "I did, but I didn't stop. I didn't see anything unusual." The hesitation was real. Whether it carried weight remained uncertain. The second person was Caroline Dern, a colleague of Lena, from the Conservancy. She had assisted Lena with wildlife tagging protocols and had been one of the last individuals to communicate with her, exchanging notes about an upcoming project. Caroline had always appeared supportive, her initial interview warm, grieving, but time altered interpretation. Rourke noticed that Caroline's messages to Lena displayed a pattern: increasingly frequent inquiries, repeated follow-ups, subtle tension about deadlines. Nothing overtly troubling, yet an intensity simmered beneath the surface. When he reached out to Caroline now, she sounded surprised but not alarmed. Her office was lined with field maps and pinned documentation, everything ordered and practical. "Lena was brilliant," Caroline said softly. "Quiet brilliance, the kind that made you want to follow her lead." "You spoke with her near the date of the incident," Rourke said. "I did. She was supposed to finalize her analysis of the wetland sampling. She was late, but that wasn't unusual." Caroline exhaled slowly. She worked according to her own internal pace. "Did that cause any tension?" Her gaze shifted slightly toward the window. Not tension, more like pressure. The project depended on her data. Rourke observed her posture, measured, poised. Not evasive, but careful. She offered a clear alibi. She had attended a funding meeting across town that evening. Several colleagues corroborated it. Her timeline held. Yet something about her tone carried a faint tremor, a gentle undercurrent of unresolved guilt or perhaps professional frustration long buried. The third individual surfaced unexpectedly: Mark Ellison, a local carpenter who had repaired window frames throughout the neighborhood that year. His name appeared only once in the early logs, almost invisible. One neighbor had casually mentioned seeing him near the Marlowe property days before the incident, but the detail had been discarded for lack of relevance. Now, with a varnish fragment in play, a carpenter became someone worth speaking to. Mark met Rourke behind his workshop, sawdust filling the air with a faint, sweet dryness. He wiped his palms on his apron before speaking. "I remember her," Mark said quietly. "She was kind, offered me water one afternoon while I worked next door." "Did you enter her home at any point?" "No, never crossed her threshold." His answer came quickly, too quickly, the kind of response rehearsed through years of knowing how questions sound in investigations. "What varnish types do you use in your work?" Mark motioned toward a row of cans on a shelf, variations of sheen and tone. Light, medium, dark, some layered, some thin. Rourke scanned them without touching. "This one," Mark said, pointing to a darker batch, "is the kind I used most often back then." "Do you remember where you were that evening?" Rourke asked. "Working late on a commission," Mark replied, "but alone, so I can't offer proof." His openness was disarming, yet openness was not certainty. A fourth person emerged in the peripheral layers of the old documents, Thomas Riven, a graduate student who had once collaborated with Lena on a research project. He had withdrawn early from the project due to methodological differences, though the records did not specify more. He had moved out of state shortly afterward. At the time, investigators had dismissed him due to distance and lack of motive. Now distance meant nothing. Motive could form in silence. When Rourke contacted him, Thomas responded via video call, the screen glowing against his dim apartment. I didn't expect this, Thomas said, voice faltering slightly. It's been so long. You worked with her, Rourke said calmly. Yes, she outpaced everyone. Sometimes it was hard not to feel overshadowed. Rourke detected no hostility, only a familiarity with self-doubt. Did you remain in contact? No, we stopped speaking after the project ended. Thomas's alibi was documented from the original case. He had been at a conference with time-stamped registration. Solid. But Rourke noted the subtleties, the discomfort in Thomas's gaze, the way he avoided mentioning the project conflict in detail. 4 persons, 4 possible connections, none definitive, all bound to Lena in different ways, carrying their own patterns of restraint, expectation, or distance. Suspects did not appear in dramatic confrontation. They appeared in the quiet spaces between memory and motive. 5 clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. The investigation progressed with the pace of winter thaw, gradual, unhurried, revealing possibilities only as older layers dissolved. Rourke sorted through each suspect's connection to Lena, cross-referencing timelines and subtle behavioral cues. Every clue that surfaced carried a dual nature, practical on its surface, emotional beneath. The varnish fragment became an anchor, the first tangible shift in the case. A forensic analyst confirmed that the layered coating style matched older handcrafted pieces rather than mass-produced items. This narrowed the pool. Only Harold and Mark had access to such materials, but similarity did not equal certainty. Rourke revisited the indentation on the wooden molding from the old photo. Under magnification, the pattern had a slight curvature, suggesting the object that struck it had a rounded edge. The shape ruled out Harold's outdoor chairs, which had square legs. It also ruled out most of Mark's tools except one, a rounded wooden mallet used for joinery. A mallet that could feasibly belong to any carpenter in the region. A mallet that would carry dark varnish, layered and smooth. But as Rourke examined the original photographs, he noticed something else. The angle of the indentation did not suggest violent force. More likely, it was the result of an accidental graze, as if someone carrying an object turned too sharply in the narrow hallway. That implied movement inside the home, not necessarily aggression, possibly surprise or haste or hesitation. He turned next to the witness contradictions. The sighting of the dark sedan stood out again. This time, Rourke obtained old parking records from nearby businesses and cross-referenced employee vehicle registrations. Only one of the persons of interest drove a dark sedan in 1991. Caroline. Her previous alibi remained strong, corroborated by multiple colleagues. She could not have been present during the time interval, but the vehicle sighting happened earlier, before the estimated time window. It did not place her at the scene at the exact moment, but it suggested she had been nearby. Rourke called her again. I don't remember driving past her home, she said gently. It's possible. I took different routes sometimes. The roads were narrow that season. Her voice remained even, but her fingers tapped lightly on her desk, a rare sign of unease. The inconsistency lingered. Meanwhile, an analysis of Lena's project notes surfaced an overlooked detail. Several pages showed subtle differences in handwriting pressure, suggesting interruptions or emotional strain during her drafting. And in the margins of one page, nearly invisible under fading ink, was a short annotation. Unresolved, must revisit. The phrase was circled once faintly. Rourke wondered what had troubled her. It was not the content, it was the tone. The looping curve of the letters carried tension, a tension unlike her usual measured script. He began interviewing people who had known her casually, not close enough to be suspects, but close enough to offer context. One coworker recalled noticing Lena seemed mildly unsettled in her last weeks, though she never elaborated. Another mentioned she had recently rearranged her living room, as if preparing for visitors she wasn't certain she wanted. Small clues, small tensions. In Rourke's mind, a pattern began forming. The inconsistencies did not point toward aggression but toward interruption. Someone entering her space unexpectedly. Someone whose presence carried emotional complexity rather than direct conflict. Someone who triggered hesitation rather than fear. Someone she knew. But who? 6. Unexpected twist reveals the least suspected person as killer. The breakthrough emerged not through dramatic discovery, but through a re-examined detail, one Rourke had dismissed initially as too minor to matter. It arrived quietly, the way truth often does. He revisited the early field notes again, focusing on language rather than facts. This time, a particular phrasing from the first responder stood out. Front door opened slightly upon arrival. Slightly opened. Not wide, not locked, not forced. Someone had exited recently enough that the door remained ajar before settling. That detail contradicted the old theory of no struggle. If Lena had simply collapsed, the door would have been secured from inside, as was her habit. Someone had left the home. Someone familiar enough with Lena that she would open the door willingly. Rourke arranged the timelines again, overlaying movement patterns, alibis, and characteristics. Harold, private but predictable, no pattern of unexpected visits. Caroline, respectful of boundaries, highly structured schedule, no history of impulsive visits. Mark, kind, reserved, no connection strong enough for an unannounced visit. Thomas, he had claimed he stopped contacting her. Yet in the old project logs, Rourke found something overlooked, a small acknowledgement line on the last document Lena submitted to the Conservancy. It read only, "Thanks to TR for earlier guidance." Not past tense, not final, the wording implied ongoing respect. Rourke called Thomas again, this time requesting an in-person interview. Thomas agreed, though his voice quivered slightly. In the interview room, Thomas looked unsettled, not fearful but burdened. "I need to ask again," Rourke said evenly. "Were you in Michigan at any point near that time, even briefly?" Thomas swallowed. "No, I was." Rourke slid the acknowledgement note across the table. "This suggests you were in recent contact." Thomas stared at the paper. His hands trembled, fingers curling slightly. "She sent that early draft before we stopped talking," he whispered. "Are you sure?" A pause, a long one, the kind that stretched thin under fluorescent light. Then Thomas exhaled a slow, breaking breath. "I visited once," he said. "Before I moved, I didn't tell anyone." Rourke's shoulders stiffened. "When?" "A day before the incident." "Why hide that?" Thomas's voice lowered. "Because it felt insignificant, but also because I didn't want it to be misunderstood." Rourke leaned in. "What happened inside the home?" Thomas closed his eyes. "I tried to convince her to rejoin the research. She declined. She said I needed to follow my own work instead of leaning on hers." His voice cracked softly, not in grief but in remembered tension.